You're a millionaire, forced into an arranged marriage, and you think you've got it all figured out. But what happens when you marry a homeless girl to escape your parents and find out she's been hiding a shocking secret? You won't believe how this story ends. Watch to find out how far the lies go. The luxurious penthouse gleamed under the soft glow of ambient lighting, its expansive windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago's dazzling skyline. Yet, despite the elegance surrounding him, Ethan Cole couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. He stood by the grand piano, his back rigid and his fists clenched. Across the room, his parents, Margaret and Gregory Cole, sat in a silence that felt suffocating, their expressions cold and unyielding, much like the marble floors beneath their feet. Ethan's life had always been mapped out for him. From a young age, he was groomed to take over the family business, to be the perfect heir to the Cole empire. His every decision, his every action had been scrutinized and molded to fit into the life his parents envisioned. But now, in his 30s, Ethan was questioning everything. The life he had built, the success he had achieved, all seemed meaningless in the face of an arrangement that wasn't his own. Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and commanding. "This isn't up for debate, Ethan. The wedding is in a month, and you will marry Charlotte Whitmore." The name echoed in his mind. Charlotte Whitmore. A name tied to wealth, legacy, and the merger of two powerful families. Charlotte was beautiful, poised, and capable, but she was a stranger to him. They had little in common beyond their families' interests. Ethan couldn't fathom marrying her, not out of love, not even out of respect. To him, it felt like nothing more than a business deal, a strategic alliance designed to secure their future. Charlotte Whitmore? Are you serious? Ethan's voice cracked with frustration. I barely know her. She's practically a stranger to me. His words were met with a stern silence. Then Gregory, his father, interjected in his deep rumbling voice, one that always commanded attention. That's all you need to know. The Whitmore partnership will secure the future of Cole Industries. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. This isn't about your personal feelings, Ethan. It's about the future of the company. His father's words hit like a punch to the gut. The weight of his family's legacy was something Ethan had carried his entire life, but he had never felt the burden so heavy as he did now. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about his happiness, his autonomy, and whether he could carve out a life for himself outside of his parents' control. I won't marry someone I don't love, Ethan shot back, his voice rising, the anger that had been simmering for years now bubbling to the surface. This is my life, not some corporate merger. I deserve more than this. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing as she regarded him with a mixture of disdain and frustration. Your life is a privilege, Ethan. One that we've worked tirelessly to provide for you. The least you can do is honor your responsibilities to the family, to the business. Ethan felt the heat rise in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. Responsibilities, he repeated, his voice low but filled with bitterness. What about my happiness? Or does that not matter? The silence in the room grew heavier, with every passing second. Margaret's gaze turned icy. Love isn't the priority here. Stability is. Charlotte is a smart, capable woman from a reputable family. She's perfect for you. She's perfect for the future of Cole Industries. Ethan's frustration only deepened, and he turned away from them, pacing across the room. This isn't about me at all, is it? He muttered bitterly, his hands clenched at his sides. This is just about securing your future. It's about continuing the legacy you've built no matter the cost. Gregory's voice boomed, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. Enough, Ethan. Either you follow through with this marriage, or you can consider yourself cut off from the family, from the company, from everything. The threat hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, its weight pressing down on Ethan's chest. The realization that his parents would disown him over a decision he had no control over hit him like a blow to the stomach. All his life he had been expected to live up to their standards, to follow their path. And now it seemed his rebellion, his desire to choose his own life, was going to cost him everything. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared out the windows, watching the glittering city below. This conversation was over. He knew it. His parents had made their decision, and they weren't going to bend. He turned his back on them, his voice hollow. Get out. Margaret and Gregory exchanged a look before gathering their things. Without another word, they walked out of the penthouse, the sound of the door closing behind them echoing in Ethan's ears. He was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of their ultimatum hanging over him like a dark cloud. Hours later, Ethan found himself walking the streets of Chicago, trying to clear his mind. The cold night air bit at his skin as he wandered aimlessly, his mind racing with thoughts of his parents, his future, and the looming wedding. It felt like everything in his life was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he turned a corner, his steps faltered when he saw her, a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, her backpack worn and frayed beside her. She was hunched over in an oversized jacket that did little to shield her from the cold. Her head lifted as he approached, revealing striking green eyes framed by messy brown hair. There was something about her gaze, a quiet strength that stopped Ethan in his tracks. "Spare any change?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, as if asking for help was something she had done 1,000 times before. Ethan hesitated, his eyes scanning her for any sign of vulnerability, but all he saw was a woman who had survived. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was someone who had lived through hardships and had the scars to prove it. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Leela," she said, her tone guarded but not hostile. Ethan's mind raced, a wild idea taking shape. He crouched slightly, meeting her gaze. "What if I told you I could change your life?" Leela narrowed her eyes, clearly suspicious. "I'd say you've been watching too many movies." Ethan let out a short laugh, surprised by the sudden lightness of the moment. "Fair enough, but what if I'm serious? What if I told you I could get you off the streets, give you a place to live, food, clothes, everything you need to start fresh?" Leela studied him for a long moment as if weighing his words. Finally she spoke, her voice tinged with skepticism. "What's the catch?" Ethan straightened up, pushing his hands into his coat pockets. "You marry me for a year. Just a business arrangement. No strings attached. After a year, we go our separate ways. You'll be protected, and I'll pay you enough to get back on your feet for good." Leela stared at him, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Marry you? A total stranger?" "I know it sounds crazy, but I'm serious," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I just need a wife for a year. It's not about love, it's about getting my family off my back." Leela's expression softened slightly, the skepticism still there but mingled with something else, curiosity. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quiet now. Ethan hesitated, the answer sitting on the tip of his tongue. "Because you don't know me, and you don't care about my money or my status. You're real, Leela, that's why." She looked down at her hands, her mind clearly racing. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath, "but maybe I don't have much to lose." A silence passed between them, and then Leela finally spoke, her voice steady but uncertain. "Okay, I'll do it. But if you're lying to me, I'm out. I'm not some fool." Ethan smiled, relieved. "Deal." As they shook hands to seal the agreement, neither of them realized just how much that moment would change their lives. As the days passed in Ethan's penthouse, the weight of the arrangement began to settle on both him and Leela. What was meant to be a simple contract, a convenient solution to a dire problem, was turning into something far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. They had both entered into this agreement with clear expectations, but now as time went on, the lines between business and reality began to blur. Leela, for her part, found herself grappling with the surreal nature of her new life. She had gone from the streets of Chicago to living in one of the most luxurious penthouses in the city. The vast expanse of the apartment, the marble countertops, the endless views of the skyline, it all felt like a dream she wasn't sure she deserved. She had never been accustomed to such opulence. Her days used to consist of performing in small coffee shops, struggling to make ends meet. Now she was living in a world she could barely comprehend, surrounded by wealth and privilege that seemed foreign to her. At first, she tried to keep her distance from the life Ethan led. She didn't want to get too comfortable in the luxurious surroundings, and she certainly didn't want to become too dependent on him. After all, she was here because of a deal. A year. No strings. That was the agreement. But as the days went by, she began to see another side of Ethan, one that wasn't just a wealthy businessman with a polished exterior. There were moments of vulnerability, flashes of humanity that caught her off guard. Ethan, too, was struggling with the reality of their situation. He had always prided himself on being in control, on making decisions that shaped his future. But now, as he watched Leela navigate this strange new world, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of guilt. He had brought her here, but had he truly understood what it meant for her to be in this position? She had gone from a life of independence to being someone's wife, a role that was both alien and suffocating to her. What did it mean for her to live in a penthouse she didn't belong to, in a marriage that wasn't real? Despite their differences, despite the walls they had both put up, a connection was forming between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something deeper, respect perhaps, or an understanding that neither of them truly wanted to be in this situation, and yet neither knew how to escape it. One evening, as Ethan sat at the grand piano in his living room, the haunting sound of a melody filled the air. He hadn't expected Leela to join him. In fact, he didn't even know she played. But there, she was standing in the doorway, her eyes watching him as his fingers danced over the keys. For a moment, the music seemed to take them both to a different place, far from the pressures of their lives, far from the expectations of their families. When the song ended, Leela walked in, her voice soft but steady. "You never told me you could play." Ethan looked up, startled by her presence. "I didn't think it was important." She raised an eyebrow. "Well, maybe it is. I didn't think someone like you could have a softer side." He chuckled lightly, setting the piano lid back down. "I don't usually share it with anyone." Leela stepped closer, leaning against the piano. "Well, maybe I'm not like the others." There was a hint of something vulnerable in her voice that made Ethan pause. "You're not," he agreed quietly, his gaze lingering on her. There was so much he hadn't said, so many things he hadn't yet admitted to himself about. Their situation, about his growing feelings for her. But here, in this moment, the words didn't matter. The music between them had said everything they needed to say. The next few weeks were filled with tension. Ethan's parents, always a looming presence in his life, continued to press him about the wedding. They never quite let up, demanding constant updates and reminding him of his obligations. Margaret Cole, his mother, was relentless in her efforts to push the marriage forward. She had made it clear that the Whitmore alliance was crucial for the future of coal industries. The weight of her expectations was suffocating, and as the day of the wedding loomed closer, Ethan found himself growing more and more conflicted. It wasn't just about the marriage anymore. It was about the life he had built for himself. Would he continue to live in the shadow of his parents' expectations, or would he choose his own path? And what about Leela? What was she truly looking for in this arrangement? Had she simply settled for a year of comfort, or was there something more to her than the street musician he had first met? One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his office, the phone rang. It was his mother. He let the phone ring for a few moments, contemplating whether or not to answer. He had been avoiding her calls for days, but he knew he couldn't keep running. With a sigh, he picked up. "Ethan." Margaret's voice was cold as usual, but there was an underlying urgency. "You need to come home. Your father and I are expecting you." He closed his eyes for a moment, the pressure building in his chest. He didn't want to go back to that house, to those expectations. But he knew he had no choice. "I'll be there soon," he said quietly before hanging up. As he walked into his parents' house, the weight of the conversation he was about to have loomed over him. Margaret and Gregory were already seated. In the study, their expressions unreadable. Ethan took a deep breath before sitting down across from them. "You've been avoiding us, Ethan," Gregory said, his voice booming in the silence. "What's going on?" Ethan felt the anger rising in him, but he kept his voice steady. "I can't go through with this wedding, Dad. I won't marry Charlotte. I'm not going to live my life for you anymore." Margaret's gaze hardened. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. This isn't just about you. This is about the future of the company, about securing our legacy." "I don't care about the company," Ethan shouted, his frustration spilling over. "I don't care about any of this. I care about my own happiness. I care about what I want. And if that means walking away from this family, then so be it." Silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was finally speaking his truth. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. But as he sat there staring at his parents, he realized that he could no longer live for them. He had spent his entire life in their shadow, and he was done. Margaret stood, her face pale with anger. "You've made your choice, Ethan," she said, her voice cold. "But know this, you're on your own now. Don't expect any help from us." As she left the room, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had just disowned his family. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally taking control of his own future. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if he could make it on his own. But as he thought about Leela, about their conversation, about the connection they had formed despite everything, he realized that maybe, just maybe, He didn't have to do it alone. The days that followed Ethan's confrontation with his parents felt like a blur. His mind was racing, constantly moving between feelings of freedom and fear. For the first time in his life, he had made a decision purely for himself, not influenced by the weight of family expectations or the looming presence of the business empire his parents had built. But as the reality of his situation set in, the consequences began to materialize. And Ethan realized that his actions were not without their own set of challenges. Leela, on the other hand, found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions as well. What had started as a simple business arrangement between them, a temporary solution to their problems, had now evolved into something she didn't fully understand. She had agreed to marry Ethan for a year that would give her a chance to escape the streets and provide for herself. But she hadn't expected to feel this, connected to him. She hadn't expected to see the vulnerabilities in him that mirrored her own, nor had she anticipated the way their interactions had slowly shifted from transactional to personal. One evening, as Ethan walked through the penthouse, he couldn't help but notice how different everything felt now. The space, once full of sterile perfection, now seemed to hold a sense of life that hadn't been there before. Leela's presence was everywhere. Her music, her laughter, the warmth she brought into the cold, polished corners of the apartment. He had never imagined that someone could make such a grand, impersonal place feel like a home. Leela, too, had her own internal struggle. She had come to the penthouse with the intention of escaping her past, of protecting herself from the vulnerability she had spent years avoiding. The arrangement with Ethan had seemed perfect at first. No emotions, just a business deal. But the more time she spent with him, the more difficult it became to maintain that emotional distance. She couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt, nor the quiet moments they shared, conversations about music, about their dreams, about the things that haunted them. Yet despite the connection they were building, Leela couldn't shake the fear that she was still just playing a role in Ethan's life. She was here to be his cover, to help him avoid the arranged marriage his parents were forcing on him, and in return, she would have a life of comfort and security. But what about after the year was up? What happened when the contract ended, when the deal was over? She had already seen how easily people in Ethan's world could turn emotions on and off like a switch, and the thought of becoming just another fleeting chapter in his life scared her more than she cared to admit. Ethan, too, was grappling with the growing complexity of their arrangement. He had thought he was merely solving a problem. He needed a wife to prevent his parents from forcing him into a marriage he didn't want. But as he spent more time with Leela, he realized that their agreement was no longer just a means to an end. It was becoming something more. He saw the strength in her, the way she carried herself with such dignity despite the hardships she had faced. He admired her resilience, and for the first time in a long time he found himself questioning the life he had lived. Ethan had spent so many years living up to his parents' expectations that he had forgotten what it meant to live for himself. He had been taught that success was measured by wealth, power, and influence. But with Leela, he began to see things differently. She didn't care about his money or his status. She was genuine, real, something he had never truly encountered in the polished circles he had been raised in. As their conversations deepened, so did his feelings for her. It wasn't just about the arrangement anymore. He found himself wondering what it would be like to have a life with someone who didn't just see him as a stepping stone in her own journey, but as someone she could share a future with. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in the living room, he watched Leela from across the room. She was sitting at the grand piano, her fingers tracing the keys softly. The sound of her music filled the space with a haunting melody, one that seemed to speak directly to him. He had always been told that emotions were a luxury, something to be avoided, but here he was, feeling something he had long since buried deep within himself, something real, something unspoken. When the song ended, Leela looked up, her gaze meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was charged, filled with the unspoken words they both knew needed to be said but didn't know how to begin. "You're good," Ethan said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. Leela smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thanks," she replied quietly. "It's just something I do, something I've always done." Ethan took a deep breath, standing up and walking toward her. "Why didn't you tell me you played?" he asked softly. She hesitated before speaking. "I didn't think it mattered." "It matters," he said, his voice steady. "You matter." Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was no mask between them. No pretense, no deal. Just two people, raw and vulnerable in a way neither had expected. In that moment, everything they had built, every wall they had put up to protect themselves, began to crumble. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. They found themselves in more candid conversations, and what had once been a business arrangement was slowly transforming into something neither of them had expected. Ethan started to see the world through Leela's eyes, the struggles she had endured, the strength it took for her to survive. And Leela in turn began to see Ethan for who he really was, someone trapped by the very life he had worked so hard to build, someone who was just as afraid of vulnerability as she was. Despite their growing connection, the tension between them remained. The clock was ticking, and the end of their year-long arrangement loomed over them both. Could they really move forward after all this time, knowing that their relationship had started out as nothing more than a contract? And if they did, what would that mean for their futures? Ethan's family was still a constant presence in his life, demanding that he fulfill his obligations, that he live up to the legacy they had built. And Leela was still haunted by the shadow of her past, by the fear that no matter how far she ran, it would always catch up to her. One evening, as Ethan and Leela sat on the balcony overlooking the city, the weight of their situation seemed to hang in the air between them. The lights of Chicago flickered below, a stark contrast to the darkness they both felt inside. "I don't know what's going to happen after this year," Leela said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "But I know I can't go back to the way things were." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the city below. "Neither can I," he said, his voice softer now. "I thought I was doing this to escape my parents, but now I'm realizing that I was running from myself too." They sat in silence, the hum of the city below providing a quiet soundtrack to their shared thoughts. Both of them had been running for so long, trying to escape their pasts, trying to find a way to control their futures. But in that moment, they understood that the only way forward was to face the truth, together. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. They both had scars, both had been shaped by the lives they had lived, and both had fears they had never voiced. But as they sat together, the city lights flickering in the distance, Ethan realized that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real. Something that wasn't based on deals or expectations, but on who they truly were, stripped of the masks they had been wearing. For the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to hope. As the days progressed, Ethan and Leela found themselves in a delicate balance, a tension that was as unavoidable as it was necessary. The facade they had constructed to protect themselves from the reality of their situation had slowly begun to crack, revealing something deeper, something they had not expected. What had started as a business arrangement, a cold, calculated decision made out of necessity, was now entwined with something more complicated, a raw and undeniable connection. Neither of them had anticipated this. Ethan had spent his life in the shadow of expectations, constantly living up to the legacy his parents had forged for him. His entire existence had been about making sure the family business thrived and that he fit into the mold they had so carefully created for him. But with Leela, everything was different. She didn't care about his wealth, his status, or the name he carried. She was the first person who had ever seen him as someone beyond his family's empire. And slowly he was beginning to see her, not as a tool to meet his parents' demands, but as an individual, a woman with her own past, her own pain and her own strength. Leela too was beginning to question everything. Her life had been a constant battle for survival, a fight to carve out a space for herself amidst the struggles of homelessness and the painful memories of a family she had tried to leave behind. She had never imagined that a simple arrangement would lead her to a penthouse overlooking Chicago's skyline, much less to a man like Ethan. But in the months since their agreement began, she had begun to realize something she hadn't expected. Ethan wasn't the cold, emotionless businessman she had assumed him to be. Beneath the surface, there was warmth, vulnerability, and a quiet yearning for freedom. And in that, she saw something familiar. She saw herself. But despite the bond that was slowly forming between them, both Ethan and Leela were still haunted by the circumstances that had brought them together. Ethan was still tied to the future his parents had planned for him, and Leela was still running from the shadow of her family's disgrace. Every day they spent together was a reminder that they were living a lie. The contract would expire soon, and then what? Would they walk away from each other as they had promised? Or would the connection they had formed make the separation impossible? The moment of reckoning came one evening, just a few weeks before, the end of their year-long arrangement. Ethan had returned home late, tired and frustrated after yet another fruitless meeting with his parents. The pressure was mounting. His mother, Margaret, had not stopped calling, demanding that he follow through with the marriage to Charlotte Whitmore. Every conversation with her left him feeling more suffocated, more trapped. His parents' vision for him had never left any room for his own desires, and it seemed as though that would be his life forever, unless he did something radical. He walked into the penthouse to find Leela in the living room, sitting by the window looking out at the city below. She seemed so at peace, so calm in the midst of everything. It made him pause for a moment to consider how much her presence had changed his life. She had brought a new perspective, a new way of seeing things, something he had never allowed himself to see before. But he had to make a decision, and it wasn't one he could make on his own. "Leela," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I've been thinking." She looked up, her green eyes meeting his. "About what?" "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty that lingered in his chest. "I can't go through with this marriage, not with Charlotte, not with anyone but you." Leela's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected him to say those words. Their entire relationship had been built on the premise of convenience, a business deal with no room for emotion. And yet here he was, declaring his feelings for her in a way that felt both terrifying and thrilling. "I can't live this life anymore," Ethan continued, taking a step closer to her. "I can't keep pretending that I'm happy with the way things are. My parents, they've controlled everything. They've controlled me, and I've been too afraid to break free." Leela stood, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ethan, you don't have to do this. You don't have to make a decision based on me. You've got your family, your future, your legacy. You don't need me complicating things." But Ethan shook his head. "No, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. I've spent my whole life doing what they wanted, living the life they planned for me. But now, I'm choosing my own path, and I want you to be a part of it." Leela swallowed, her emotions flooding her. She had never allowed herself to believe that someone like Ethan, someone with so much power and privilege, could ever truly see her, could ever understand the struggles she had faced. But in that moment, she realized that they were more alike than she had ever imagined. Both of them were running from something. Both of them had been trying to escape from their pasts. But maybe, just maybe, they could stop running together. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never let anyone in before. I've always been afraid of losing myself, of letting someone else control my life again." Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "I won't control you, Leela. I want to build something with you. Something real, something that's ours." Leela looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and hope in equal measure. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? She had spent so long trying to survive, trying to keep her distance from everyone, afraid that if she let her guard down, everything would fall apart. But here was Ethan offering her a chance at something more, something that wasn't based on contracts or expectations, but on choice. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to trust someone like you." "I get that," Ethan replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "But we can learn together. We don't have to have all the answers. We just have to take the first step." Leela's heart fluttered as she looked at him. The weight of their pasts, the mistakes, the fears, they were all still there. But for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they could move forward. Together. The next few days were a whirlwind of change. Ethan began to distance himself from his family's expectations, making it clear to his parents that he would no longer live his life according to their plans. Margaret was furious, but Ethan didn't care anymore. For the first time in his life, he was making decisions for himself, not for anyone else. He had finally taken control. Leela too began to let go of the walls she had built around herself. She started performing again, but this time it wasn't about survival. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dreams. Ethan supported her every step of the way, attending her performances, standing by her side as she began to rebuild her life from the ground up. But their journey wasn't without its challenges. As the end of their year-long arrangement approached, both of them wondered, what would happen next? Would they stay together? Would they continue to fight for the future they had started to build? Or would the pressures of their past tear them apart? Ethan knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back to the life he had lived before. He had found something real in Leela, something worth fighting for. And as the days passed, he realized that no matter what happened, he couldn't let her go. Leela, too, was beginning to see that she didn't have to carry her past alone anymore. She had Ethan by her side, and for the first time in years, she felt like she had a future worth fighting. For the road ahead was still uncertain, but for both of them, the journey was just beginning. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they would face them together. As the year drew to a close, Ethan and Leela found themselves at a precipice, standing on the edge of a future they had never imagined when they first crossed paths. What had started as a practical, business-driven arrangement had transformed into something far deeper, more personal, and more challenging than either of them could have predicted. The time was fast approaching when they would have to make a decision, not just about the terms of their contract, but about the direction of their lives, separately or together. Ethan had spent so much of his life running on autopilot, his every decision guided by his parents' expectations and the carefully mapped-out plan they had set for him. His future was never his own. It was an extension of his family's legacy, a cog in the machine that was coal industries. But in the months since meeting Leela, everything had shifted. He had discovered a new kind of freedom in her presence, a freedom to be himself, to explore his own desires without the weight of familial obligation constantly pressing down on him. Leela had shown him what it meant to live for oneself, to carve out a path that wasn't dictated by others. And now, as the days ticked down, Ethan found himself questioning everything once more. Could he continue living for his parents and their company? Or would he finally step out from the shadows and live the life he wanted? Leela too was facing a turning point. When she had agreed to marry Ethan, it had been out of necessity. She had nothing to lose, and the promise of safety, stability, and a chance to rebuild her life was too great an offer to refuse. She had known from the beginning that this was supposed to be temporary, that she would never allow herself to become too attached to him or to the life that Ethan's world represented. But as the months passed, her feelings had become more complicated. The connection she had with him was undeniable. And while she had fought it, she couldn't help but acknowledge that she had begun to care for him in ways she hadn't intended. The fear that had governed her life for so long, the fear of losing herself, of becoming entangled in someone else's story, had begun to fade. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around the pain of her past. But the question loomed. Was this real? Was what she felt for Ethan based on genuine emotion, or was it just a side effect of the arrangement they had created? She had spent so much of her life running from the weight of her family's name, from the shadow of the scandal that had defined her early years. She had never allowed anyone close enough to see the real her, and now, with Ethan, she was struggling to reconcile the person she had become with the person she was still trying to outrun. The night before the contract was set to expire, Ethan found himself pacing the penthouse. The silence in the apartment felt oppressive, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. He couldn't help but think about the future that awaited him, what his life would look like if he followed through with the marriage his parents had insisted upon. Charlotte Whitmore was the ideal candidate in their eyes, a perfect match in terms of family background, wealth, and social standing. But for Ethan, she was a stranger, someone he had no connection to, no emotional bond with. He had always been expected to marry for stability, to secure the future of the business, but he was finally starting to understand that a future built on those principles alone would never satisfy him. As Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering city below, he thought about Leela. She had come into his life by chance, a stranger offering him a solution to his problem, but in the months since, she had become something far more important than that. She was the one person who had ever seen him for who he truly was, who had never tried to mold him into something he wasn't. She didn't want his money or his status. She wanted him, the real him, the one he had hidden behind walls of duty and expectation for so long. Leela too had spent the evening reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. The life she had imagined for herself, a life filled with music, passion, and authenticity, had felt out of reach for so long. But somehow, in the quiet moments with Ethan, she had started to believe again. She had started to believe that maybe she deserved more than the cold, hard reality she had been living. She had never asked for anything from him, never expected him to offer her anything but the terms of their agreement, but over time, the lines had blurred. She could no longer deny that her feelings for Ethan had grown deeper than she was willing to admit even to herself. But now, as the expiration of their contract loomed, Leela found herself at a crossroads. Would she return to the streets, to the life she had fought so hard to escape? Or would she take a chance on Ethan and the possibility of something more, something real, even if it meant exposing herself to the vulnerability she had worked so hard to protect? As Ethan walked into the living room the next morning, he found Leela sitting at the grand piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys as though she were lost in thought, caught between the past and the future. The familiar melody that filled. The air was both soothing and haunting, a perfect reflection of the uncertainty they both felt. Leela looked up as he entered, her green eyes meeting his. "Morning," she said softly, her voice betraying the weight of the thoughts she had been carrying. "Morning," Ethan replied, his voice thick with the emotions he had been grappling with. "We need to talk." Leela nodded, setting her hands down on the piano keys and letting the music fade into silence. "I know." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision that lay before him. "I don't want to go through with the marriage my parents have arranged for me," he began, his words coming out in a rush. "I've spent my entire life doing what they've wanted, living the life they've planned for me, but I can't do it anymore. I've been trying to build my own life, my own future, and I want that to include you." Leela's heart skipped a beat. "Ethan." "No," he interrupted, taking a step closer to her. "I don't want to pretend anymore. I want to build something real, something with you. I want a future where I'm not just a pawn in my parents' game. I want a future with you. No contracts, no deals, just us." Leela felt a surge of emotion wash over her, a mix of fear and hope, excitement and doubt. "I don't know if I can trust this," she said, her voice trembling. "We've been living in a world of lies for so long. How do we know it's real?" Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Because we're choosing it, Leela. We're choosing this together. Not because of any contract or obligation, but because we want to. We're taking a chance on us." For the first time in a long time, Leela let herself believe. She had spent so long building walls, protecting herself from the pain that came with letting others in. But Ethan's words were like a lifeline, a chance to finally live her life on her own terms. She had no idea what the future held, but in that moment she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her choices anymore. As she looked into Ethan's eyes, she saw a future that was uncertain, but full of possibility. She didn't need all the answers right then and there. They would figure it out together, step by step. And so as they stood in the penthouse, hand in hand, they took the first step into a future they had both longed for, but never believed they could have. A future where they weren't defined by their past or the expectations of others, but by their own choices, their own love. A future that was finally, truly theirs. The story of Ethan and Leela is one of transformation, resilience, and the courage to break free from the chains of societal expectations. It serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how far we've come, no matter the weight of our pasts, we always have the power to choose our own path. Both Ethan and Leela were caught in the suffocating grip of their circumstances. Ethan, bound by his family's demands and legacy, and Leela trapped by the remnants of her family's scandal. But through their unlikely connection, they learned to take control of their lives and embrace the possibility of a future defined by love, trust, and choice, rather than duty and obligation. This story teaches us that sometimes the most significant steps we can take are the ones that challenge everything we've known, the ones that force us to face our deepest fears and vulnerabilities. It's about stepping into the unknown, trusting ourselves, and daring to choose a life that aligns with our true values, not the ones imposed upon us. Ethan and Leela's journey shows that love and authenticity can grow in the most unexpected of places, and that true freedom comes when we shed the expectations of others and embrace our own desires. If you've been inspired by Ethan and Leela's story, or if you believe in the power of change and personal growth, please subscribe to our channel. Your support fuels the creation of more stories like this, filled with hope, inspiration, and the courage to break free. Stay tuned for more incredible content. Together, we can continue to explore the journeys of transformation that remind us all that it's never too late to choose a new path. Thank you for being part of this journey.